So I didn't prepare anything too much because I really wanted to make this kind of organic and more of a demo so we could take advantage of what everyone was kind of interested in when it comes to learning a little bit about Drupal and Gatsby. So first, I just want to ask a quick question, and feel free to either, we're a pretty small group, so you can unmute if you want, or just drop it in the chat. But I just want to gauge everyone's level of knowledge with Gatsby. So the first question is, have you ever used Gatsby locally? So have you ever downloaded and actually ran anything? Because that might determine how we take this demo. If not a lot of people have done much with Gatsby, we'll start at the very beginning. And if there's some people that have tried it, then maybe we'll go and move forward a little bit. So far it looks like no is the predominant answer. Okay, so we got one that has done some locally, but so it looks like the majority has never downloaded or run Gatsby, which is fun for me because then we can start at the beginning. So the goal here is we have an hour. I don't know how much we're going to get through, so I'm going to preface it by saying that. But what we'll try to do is have a Drupal site, and we will spin up a brand new Gatsby site and see if we can get it to start sourcing content from our Drupal site and build a Gatsby site with it. And Zeth, since you have some experience, definitely let me know as I run into problems, which I probably inevitably will. I used to work a lot more on building Gatsby sites, but now I work a lot on the internals, so I don't get as much opportunity to work on the front end stuff as I would like. So I might, I'm sure we'll run into some problems and we'll have to debug, but that's hopefully part of the experience that we're going to go through together. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let me pull a few things up, so just give me a few seconds. All right. Okay, so you should see a command line, and I'm going to open up a new tab and make it a little bit bigger. And let me know if you can see that or if you're having any problems. Hopefully that's good enough. All right. So the first thing we're going to do, I'm just going to go into a folder, and the first thing I'll preface is saying you'd have to have the Gatsby command line installed, which I'm going to open, see what we find. So there'd be, first we wanted to install the Gatsby command line, which we could use something like that. NPM or yarn can be used, just like if you're familiar with Drupal 8, you probably use Composer, which is a PHP package manager. NPM and yarn are, I guess, just node package managers. So the commands are somewhat similar. And so I already have Gatsby installed. So once Gatsby is installed, I can do Gatsby new, and I'm just going to call it DrupalCorn. And hopefully this works. We'll see. It's going to take a little bit of time, but it's going to install a Gatsby site locally with just a default starter, which means it's not going to have much in it. There are all kinds of different Gatsby starters, which you can think of a starter as, if you're from Drupal, it's kind of like an install profile. It could have different plugins installed with it. It's like a default start state that you could have, different ways to, if you want to do, different stylings, whether you want to use Sass or CSS and JS or platforms like Emotion, if you've heard of some of those, it could install that for you. It could install different source plugins. So it's really just like an install profile. The default one is what we're going to use here. But again, on the Gatsby docs, you can see there's a whole bunch of different starters that you can use. So we're going to follow the instructions. We're going to change into this DrupalCorn directory. And I'm just going to show you what's in here. So there's some files in here. Actually, I'm going to do that. So you can see it actually installs it from Git. So there's a Git repository in here with my Gatsby site. If I run Gatsby develop, I already have a site running. Let me close this out. Don't want to run two at the same time, which you could. I just will keep it simple. So I'm running Gatsby develop. This is going to read my Gatsby config file and start running my project. And if you're not familiar with Gatsby, it's commonly known as a static site generator, but it's important to know that it's more than just a static site generator. It's built on top of React, so it's really like a React framework. So anything that you can do in React, you can do in Gatsby. So you can build really dynamic websites or web applications, but the benefits are it starts as a static site. So if you have a lot, let's say you have 70% static content and 30% things you want dynamic, you could build that. So one example I like to give is if you're building an e-commerce site, you might have 1,000 products and you want those pages to be static. And the reason you want that is because it's super fast. But you want some components on that page to maybe be dynamic, like the add to cart button, or maybe the price you want to load dynamically in case you have specials or in case that user has some kind of coupon added to their cart. So you could hit the actual Drupal website and pull in the actual price live when the page loads rather than making the price components static. So hopefully that makes sense. And the reason it is so fast because it's static is one thing I like to say is if you're coming from Drupal, and I've worked on a lot of Drupal 6, Drupal 7, Drupal 8 websites, you work really hard to make the website fast by adding caching. And so there's quite a bit of work you have to do into that to make a Drupal website really performant. And it absolutely can be done. But by default, it's kind of hard to do. If you're building a larger scale Drupal site, you got to put some work into it. Where on Gatsby, by default, it's going to be really performant and you have to work really hard to make it not performant. So I've certainly seen a lot of fast Drupal websites and I've seen a lot of slow Gatsby websites, but by default, they're flipped. By default, Drupal is going to be pretty slow and by default, Gatsby is going to be very fast. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And let's see. This is our default starter. There's just some pages, not too much here. And if we go ahead and open this up so we can look at the code, give me 1 second to pull it up. I'll make this a little bigger. Okay, so we have our folder here, and let's go ahead and look at our source. We have this pages directory. This is this index page. So you can see it says, hi people. So let's just say, hi DrupalCorn. And if we save this and then I go back, you'll see it immediately changes. So there's no refreshing the page, nothing like that. It's all hot reloading. And so anytime I make a change, it's going to immediately show that change. So that's kind of a nice experience, is that you don't have to necessarily refresh the page when you're making changes to the site. You can see that this is pretty much looks like HTML. So if you're not familiar with React, it's going to look a lot like HTML. There's just some of these extra components. Like there's this SEO tag is an SEO component, which gets loaded in. And we're not going to spend too much time going over the intro to React, but just know that if you're familiar with HTML, React, of course, is more complicated than that, but it's going to start to make sense as we look through some of this a little bit more. But if you are familiar with React, this should look pretty straightforward. So the first thing that we want to do is we have our site here. It's nothing too fancy, but we want to create, we're going to pull in content from Drupal. In this example, let's say we wanted to create a blog and we wanted to use Drupal as our CMS because we love Drupal and we want to be able to, install modules, add fields, and, build the content editing experience we want with Drupal, but essentially replace the front end of Drupal, so Drupal's theming engine, with a Gatsby front end site. So that's our goal, is to create a decoupled Drupal site. So we have our content editing experience on the Drupal site, and then our actual live website will be this statically rendered Gatsby site. So I have a Drupal site here, and this is going to look pretty basic. I have some posts in here, and it's just a really simple demo. There's some multilingual stuff we'll ignore. I've used this in some other demos, but it's just a simple content type. And it's just an article with an image field. And I think this is what comes out of the box. And this Drupal site might be a little outdated. I think it's running Drupal 8.7, maybe something like that. So it might not be even the most up to date, but it would work with whether you're using Drupal 9 or any Drupal 8 website. And you can see that it has a body, has an image field, has some tags, and the content is pretty basic. If we look at this post, it's just title, some post, and an image with some alt text. And that's all there is to it. Okay, so now the first thing we want to do is we want to be able to pull this content into our Gatsby site. So Gatsby has this thing called sourcing. It can source content from any CMS. So this could be WordPress, Drupal, could be some of the headless CMSs you might have heard of, such as Contentful. It could be, it could pull in content from Markdown files locally, so you could use Markdown files. And what this node sourcing step or this data sourcing step does is it goes out to these external places, pulls in all the data locally into your Gatsby develop server, and then allows you to access that data using GraphQL. And if you're not familiar with GraphQL, we're going to look at it. Think of it as where you might have used SQL or SQL to access data from a database. GraphQL is just like a query language for APIs, but in this case, the API is just like a local database. So you're using GraphQL similar to how you would use SQL to pull in data from a database, and that's going to allow us to build our pages. The first thing we're going to do is let's look at Gatsby source Drupal. And this is the plugin for pulling data into Gatsby from Drupal sites. So this pulls data from Drupal 8 sites with the Drupal JSON API module installed. The only thing I had to do on this Drupal site to get this to work would be to install, go into Extend and click the JSON API button to install that module. And to prove that, if I go to /JSON API, you can see there's all kinds of data here that JSON API would expose. So this is how we can install this. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to shut down the Gatsby server. Let me just make sure. So in this case, I'm using Yarn because that's my default package manager. The commands are going to be in NPM by default, but it really you can just change it whether you're using Yarn or NPM. So I'm going to do yarn add Gatsby source Drupal. And this is going to go ahead and pull this in. And one thing I didn't mention is if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. It's kind of hard to pull up the chat when you're screen sharing, but I'll try to keep that up. Or just feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. So I know if I might be going too fast or you might have questions along the way. Don't feel like this is all just 100% a presentation. This is, think of it as a conversation or discussion. So if you have questions, let me know. So this one went ahead and added this. And if I were to go to the code and look in the package.json, you'll see that now Gatsby source Drupal is added. So that went ahead and was added into my project. Now there's this Gatsby config file. In this Gatsby config file, think of this as just your admin settings for each plugin, similar to how a lot of Drupal modules have, admin pages that you configure. A lot of Gatsby plugins have configuration options that you can set. If we go back to the documentation, you can see there's this settings that we're going to have to add in. So we're going to go ahead and drop this in here. Doesn't matter the order. So it's saying this is for the Gatsby source Drupal plugin. We don't need to worry about the API base because we're using the default, which is JSON API. So I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of that. And this base URL is just the URL to my Gatsby or my Drupal site, excuse me. So that's this right here. So I should be able to do that. And now if I save this and I were to run Gatsby develop, it should source all the data from JSON API and pull it locally into, think of it as like my Gatsby database. Under the hood, it's using something called Redux, which is kind of like a storage engine for React projects, which you may have heard of. But let's see, you can see this step here that it said starting to fetch all data from Drupal. It pulled all the data from my Drupal site, including the remote files. And now if I were to go to this here, it's going to give me this graphical interface. Think of this like a SQL Explorer for your database. But in this case, the database is going to be my locally running Gatsby develop server that now has all of my content that were sourced from the Drupal site. And the way this works is when I run that Gatsby develop command, it's going to go out to this link here. It's going to traverse all of these JSON API links, which if we were going to go to, let's find the one for node article. And then it's going to traverse all of these entities. So every entity in Drupal that's available through JSON API gets pulled into my Gatsby Redux data store. And then I can use that when building out sites. So let's see, let's look for all node article. And then I'm going to get rid of this because this was from a different site. All node article, nodes. And let's go ahead and pull in the ID, the title, the body. We'll bring in, we'll say the processed body field. And let's just start there. So if I hit the play button, it's going to run this GraphQL query. And it's going to say, okay, here's the UUID for this node article. Here is the title. And here's the processed body text. It's going to see it's going to have all of them in there. So there's not too much, but that's all the data that is in the article content type. And you can see there's menus, there's I have a content type called multilingual post. I think there's pages maybe somewhere in here if I have any pages. It's only going to show items that have data. So if there's no data, it wouldn't show it. But what we can do is we can use these GraphQL queries to now build pages on our Gatsby site. So by default, it provides all the data, but we have to actually build the pages. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a page for each of these articles. So each of these articles should have a page, and it should be available at the URL available path alias. So in this case, if I play that, I want this post to be on my Gatsby site. So it'd be localhost 8000/article/guitar-post. That would be ideally what I want this post to be at. And I want to include the image as well. So let's go ahead and see what that might look like. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this Gatsby Node.js file. And this Gatsby Node.js file is a special file that can be set to run during the node sourcing process. So when I first run Gatsby develop, when it pulls in all that data, I want to say, after you pull in all the data, look for all the articles and create a page for each of those articles. So the first thing I'm going to do is use the create pages API. And this is all documented in, if you do a getting started with Gatsby, you'd see this. And I'm going to type some of this out quickly, and then I'll try to walk through it. Some of this is going to look, some of the syntax, if you're not as familiar with some modern JavaScript, is going to look a little different. But if you aren't as familiar, I'd definitely brush up on some of the ES6 JavaScript things, some of the latest changes in the JavaScript language in the last few years, because that would help with some of this. And I did do a presentation on modern JavaScript. I think it was at Decoupled days, maybe. And I'm hoping that video is available somewhere. Maybe I can try to find it. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to create a GraphQL query for these articles. And let's go to here. The only thing we need to pull in right now is really the ID and the path. We don't even really need the title, I don't think, because, and you'll see why this is set up this way in a second, but I just need to know the ID and the path for what I'm going to create these articles at. So I'm just going to drop this in here. So I'm going to run this GraphQL query, and this await means run it and wait here. Once it's resolved, one thing that always gets me is semicolons are pretty much now optional. So sometimes you'll see me use semicolons, sometimes I won't. It really doesn't matter, but old habits, I guess. So now what I need to do is I'm going to traverse this. So I get back articles, which has a data object on it. And then once I get to that data object, I have to basically traverse down this tree. So data.allNodeArticle, that's right here, .nodes. And then I'm going to use the JavaScript map function, which is essentially just a loop. It's just going to loop through it or map it to something. And I'm going to use article data. And we'll do something like that. And so all this data is going to be available at this variable name. And what I want to do is I want to use this create page function. And the create page function needs a few things. Again, this is all available on the documentation of it, but it needs a path. So the path that I want to give it is this path alias, right? Article data dot path dot alias. One thing to note is if some of my Drupal pages didn't have path aliases, this would probably cause a problem and error out. I have to give it a component, which think of this as like my theme template if you're from, if you've done some Drupal theming. And to use that, I'm going to need this path object here. So we're just using this path option and path.resolve. And we're going to have a source templates article.js file, which I'll go ahead and create right now. So I'm just creating that file. It's empty, but we're going to put some stuff in there in a little bit. So back to here. And now we can pass in context. And this context is any variables we want to pass into this template. So in this case, I'm just going to pass in something called the article ID. And that's just going to be this UUID for this article. I need a comma here. There we go. Okay. So that's step one. Now it's going to create a page, but there's nothing in this template yet. So the next thing we want to do is we're going to want to go to this template and actually display some data. So let's go to this template. And if you hear me clicking, it's because I'm pulling up some other examples I've done. I'd love to say that I just did all this from memory, but I'd have to look at the docs probably if I was not looking at some old code that I wrote. But we're going to go ahead and import some things. So we always have to import React at the top. That's a requirement. We're going to import GraphQL from Gatsby. Let's see what this there is. Yes, lint is disabled. Yeah, we don't need to worry about the linter right now. And let's start there. And so there's the first thing you almost always do is you kind of have a default layout, right? When you think about pages in your Drupal site, you have some components that are shown on all pages. Maybe it's the header with the menu and maybe the footer, and then you're only caring about the body stuff. So by default in Gatsby, there's this layout.js, which the layout has a header, has a footer on there, and then this main section is what gets populated. So we want to use that layout. So we're going to import the layout from components/layout. You don't need to add the .js, so it's going to import this layout component. And we just need to create a React component here. So in this React component is going to get passed in data, and we're going to specify how that data gets populated here in a little bit. So that data gets populated by a GraphQL query. So we're going to export, and this variable name could be data, could be query. It doesn't really matter. It's going to look for a GraphQL query. And so it's going to look like that. And then at the bottom of the page, I need to export my actual React component. And this is just, this stuff here is just React. So we create a React component and then we export that component. And then this query right here that we're going to run is going to pull in the actual data. So we can then at this point, this is where we can go in and load anything we want, such as title, body field, any media items or files or anything that this article needs to pull in from Drupal, or that originally came from Drupal and now is sitting locally in our Gatsby development server. So in this case, we're going to try to keep this simple. Let's just go in. We'll keep the ID, title, body, processed, and let's start there for now. Just because images are a little trickier. So we'll start here, make sure we get it. I'd rather get everything working and then we can start adding stuff once we have kind of a really basic working model. So I'm going to grab this query here. And the only thing is I'm not pulling in all node articles in this point. I want to be pulling in a specific node article. So I'm just going to grab this and let's, I'll explain this here in a second, but what I want to do is I'm creating a query, and what happens with this query is I can get passed in the context that was passed in from here. So in this case, this article ID gets passed into this query. So what do I want to do here? Well, I want to take that parameter, that article ID, which is a string, and I'm going to pass that into node article as basically a filter. So this is going to filter and only pull this specific article's data. And if I were to go back to GraphQL, you can see if I close out of this, there should be a node article, and there should be the ability to do a filter somewhere right there. And I want that filter to equal, and then I could drop my UUID right there. So if I had a specific, well, we can try it, I guess. I have a UUID right there. So let's drop that in. So in this case, it's this UUID. And what do I want? Well, let's just get the ID and the title. And if I play that, you can see I only get the ID and the title for this specific ID. So hopefully that makes sense how that's filtering. So when I look back here, it's taking the article ID that's passed in. It's using that as my filter, which I don't need $2 there. And then I'm going to grab the fields that I want, which in that case is ID, title, and the process body text. I don't technically need this ID field because it's already there, but I guess maybe I might use it, but so I'll grab it anyways. Either way, there's the data that I want. And now this query is going to populate data in this data field. And the reason this is really powerful is because think about, this is really useful for building a page just from Drupal, but let's say you had multiple data sources. You might have, some things built with Drupal, and maybe you have a different CMS or something populating different data, or maybe you have a Shopify site where you have products coming from Shopify. So you can think of that you could query multiple things from different data sources on any individual page, which is why this seems like a kind of a complicated extra step, but it's also a really flexible and powerful step because you can pull in data from all over and then build out your pages. So now we have to build what we want this to actually look like. So we're going to wrap everything in a layout component. Remember, that's just so the header and the footer is going to show the same. We'll use an H1, and let's actually, this is not quite right. We need to return this component here. And let's go ahead and do const article equals data.node article just to keep things a little shorter. So now I went into data, which is this query, .node article, and now I can get the ID, title, or the body processed right from this article variable. So right here, I'm going to try article.title. And then I'm going to create a div. And this is something in React, which is just dangerously set inner HTML. And that's just because it wants you to know that you are actually, injecting raw HTML into this div. So you just need to be careful, right? You need to know where it's coming from. But in this case, it's coming from Drupal, and the body content should already be processed if we use this process field here. So let's go ahead and go to article.body.processed. And again, I traverse this tree. So the article, then the body, then the processed. So each of these brackets is basically a dot here. And I think that's it. And let's go ahead and just try this. So if this works, all of our articles should be available at their correct path, and it should just show the title and the body. All we need to do is come back here, and we're going to need to rerun our Gatsby development server because we changed, anytime you change anything in Gatsby node, you need to restart it, at least for now. And let's let this thing run. It says it looks like we might be having an error. The GraphQL query and the non-page component. So we have some error. Something's not working in our Gatsby node. So this isn't going to work yet. We got a problem, but let's go ahead and look at it and just verify that it's not going to work. So ideally, we would be able to, if we go to this post, I would be able to pull in this right here. And it's not going to work quite yet. So this page doesn't exist. So let's do some debugging and figure out why this is not working.
It looks like you might have a typo on line 11. Should be plural actions. I don't know if that's the cause, but
that's it. And you can see this tells me I need to restart my development server. It's going to go ahead and restart that for me. Thank you for that catch. I think that's probably, that there might be more problems than that, but that's certainly one problem. So all this is this actions provides a bunch of different APIs. In this case, this create page function is what is used to create pages. So if I'm not destructuring from the right variable, it's not going to be able to actually create the pages. There you go. Good catch. Thank you. So now this post is available, right? So now any post that I have here, so if I just go to a 404, something that doesn't exist, you can see now I have all these posts available. So this post is here. This post is here. So you can see I have all the articles available on the site. One thing we could do is we could get that image to show up. Let's not do that quite yet. Let's create a listing page. So right now I shouldn't have to go to a 404 page to see all the articles, right? It'd be nice if we could access it all at, /articles, and that would have a nice listing of all the articles on our site. Think of this as we're building a view, right? In Drupal, you just build a view for this. In this case, we're going to build a page that lists those articles. So under pages is where you can create any, think of these as like your static pages. In this case, I'm going to create one called articles.js. And in this case, whatever is before the .js is what the path is going to be. So in this case, it would be just articles. And in this, we're going to do pretty much the same thing we did before, where we're going to import React from React. Oops. import GraphQL, because we're going to make a GraphQL query. We're going to import our layout. And let's start there. And we're going to create a React component. It's going to get some data. And then that's going to allow us to actually output the results of their page. And we're going to write our query, our GraphQL query. And in this case, the main difference that we're going to do is instead of just pulling in one specific article, we'll pull in a bunch of articles. And then we need to export. Did I pluralize? Yeah, pluralize that. Then we're going to export that React component. And any page has to export a React component because that's how Gatsby knows it takes that React component and then renders the page. So in our GraphQL query, I'm just going to copy this from the example I have and drop it in here. And we'll walk through what this does. But since we only have about 20 more minutes and I'd like to leave a little time for questions, I'm going to try to move a little faster in getting this set up. So this is sorting by the created date. It's ordering it descending, title, ID, body, created date. In this case, it's also pulling in some information about the image, the alt text for the image. And anytime you use, we'll say an entity reference field, which an image or media items will always use entity reference fields in Drupal, right? Everything's entities and they're related. It's created as a relationship. So if you think about if you're using some kind of reference field, it's always going to be under this relationships field in GraphQL. So in this case, we're creating a relationship to this field image, and we're pulling in this local file. And this is using Gatsby's image component. Don't worry too much about what this is doing right now. It's basically saying I want a fluid image with a max width of 600. If you look up documentation for Gatsby image, it'll be documenting like what this syntax does, why it's necessary, how it works, all that. But just know that that's creating the image. And I'm going to grab the articles here. Again, I just traverse the data.allNodeArticle, not plural, .nodes, and then I have access to this. And what I want to do is I'm going to return this React component. I'm going to wrap it in a layout. We're going to give an H1, just call it articles. And then we're going to use some JavaScript syntax here to articles.map, which again, this is just going to map each article or loop. Think of it as a loop. We're looping through each article. And what do we want to do for each of these articles? Well, we're going to display something. So we could just display the title, or what we really want to do here is it's easier, since we're using React, let's just create a new component for what we'll call our teaser or our preview. So I'm going to create a component called article preview. Again, this is because I'm using React, I can just create any components I want and then load them in. So I can think of this as a reusable component that I'm going to create that I can use in any place. In this case, I'm going to use it to display a teaser, but I could use it in other places on the site. If there's other places where I have preview, article previews, and I want to be able to reuse this component, it's helpful because you can reuse things. And when we look at what that component's going to look like, I'm just going to drop it in here and we'll explain it. Let's try to move a little more quickly. We're importing React. We're importing Gatsby link component, and think of Gatsby links as like a supercharged A tag. So if you're using HTML, you normally just use an A tag for a link, but Gatsby link does things like preload in the backend. So when you load the page, if you were to pull that link up in your viewport, it's going to start preloading that data. So when you click on it, it's super fast. So it does a lot of helper things to speed up the performance of navigation internally on your site. So anytime you're doing internal links, you want it to be a Gatsby link component. And then Gatsby image component is something that allows you to optimization of images. So it does like the fade in effect and speeds up the loading of images. So you want to use that instead of just a normal image tag. And what we're doing here with the article preview is we're going to pass in a title, a path, the image, the alt text of the image, and then a summary, which would be, think of that as like a teaser component or the teaser body text, right? We don't want just, we don't want to display the whole article. We want to display maybe just the teaser part from Drupal. And we're going to link to the path, and we're going to put the title in an H2. We're going to then display this image with this image and this alt text. And it's going to be a fluid width image, which means as you change the size of the browser, it will shrink or enlarge. And then we're going to set the HTML as the summary. So now all we need to do, what's this notice here? Just linter error again. We don't need to worry about that. Okay, so now we can use this article preview component. And the way we're going to use that here is we're going to use this article preview. There it is. And all we need to do is pass in all of these values through props. So React requires a key prop, which just needs to be a unique value for each one of these article previews. So the article ID is always going to be a unique value. This could be the path, it could be anything. It's just something that React requires. And then we're just going to pass in, if we look, we need a title, a path, an image, an alt, and a summary. So the title is going to come from, remember, article, which gets us down to this level, dot title. Then we have path, which is article.path.alias. If we follow this down, path.alias. And then we have image, which this one's a little trickier because it's article.relationships.field image. So we're down to here. Now we got to go .local file .child image sharp .fluid. So you can see this one's kind of tough to get to. Anytime you're traversing relationships, it's not really hard once you know how to follow the path, but it's, they can get kind of long. So I just followed that path, article.relationships.field image, local file, child image sharp fluid. And this will get that fluid width image that it can get passed in. The alt text is available from field image alt. So article.fieldimage.alt. And then the summary, and we're going to do a little magic here. I'm just going to drop this in. Okay, so what I'm going to say is if the article.body summary exists, so if you've created a teaser on your Drupal site, if you create a summary on Drupal, then use the summary. Otherwise, just take the body text and we'll just take the first 300 characters. Again, it's not going to be anything fancy. It's just gonna, might cut off mid-word, but it's good enough for now to show an example. Ideally, you just set you make sure the summary is set in Drupal and then it works. Okay, so we got an issue here. We did not close out our tag. There we go. Now, if we go to /articles, let's see. Element type is invalid. Let's see what we're doing here. Let's try to restart the Gatsby development server and just see. Yeah, it looks like it might have aired out on us when I saved it, that component didn't work. So since I saved it and that component didn't exist, it caused an error. You should have been able to do that without having to restart. But if you do something that causes it to break, so something's messed up here. Typo. Hopefully it'll just rebuild and work. Let's see. It's thinking. It's thinking too long. Something's broke. Let's try restarting and see if we get another error. All right, maybe it worked this time. There we go. So you can see, and you see how it kind of did that load in effect. The other thing I'll show you that's kind of cool, if we go to the network tab, watch as I scroll down, you should see, well, maybe not. Oh, maybe, so it actually is set up. So let's say I hover over it. So now I hover over this, you see how it immediately, you can see the network tab have activity. So if I were a user and I was going to go to click on this, as soon as I hover, it's already starting to load. And the reason that's useful is then if, let's say there's a half a second before I click, that's a half a second faster that experience is going to be, because that page is already preloaded. So now when I click on it, it's, you see how there's almost not even there's not even a flash. It's so fast because the data is already there. It's almost like it's just switching between the two pages. So it's super fast, super performant. The last thing I will say, so this is pretty cool. Last thing I'm going to do is I'll take about 5 more minutes and see if I can get this shown how it works, because it's a pretty cool experience. And then once I do that, we'll hopefully have 5 minutes for questions. There is a question that says, what's the best way to deal with fields that are null or empty? So that can be tricky. As long as you have, let's say you have an image field, or let's just say you have a text field in Drupal and it doesn't have any data. If it doesn't have any data at all in any of the content, let's say it's on my article content type, then it's not going to show up on JSON API and I'm not going to be able to use it in my Gatsby site. But if one piece of content has data in there, then JSON API is going to show that field and Gatsby is going to know that that field exists. That being said, as long as one piece of content had it, if it was an optional field and some of your pages didn't use it, you could just do a check with JavaScript and just say, if this exists, use it, display this part of the page. If it doesn't exist, don't display anything. So it's just like, you could, in a PHP template, you check if it's null or if it exists. So if this text field exists, display it in a component, otherwise don't display it. Hopefully that made sense. So there is a Gatsby Drupal module, and it's one that I'm a maintainer of, and it allows you to set up live preview and incremental builds. So one of the problems, especially, this is great if you're using it for a small site like a blog, but if you had actual content editors, the problem is there's this build process that it has to go through, right? Where it pulls in all the data and it actually builds the site. And that's not necessarily a great experience for a user, because they want to be able to, if they're a content editor, they want to be able to see their content before they deploy it. So when you actually do, we've been running the Gatsby develop command. If we were going to deploy this site, we would run Gatsby build, and that would build, a production ready version, which you could host on any static hosting provider. A lot of people use Netlify, but you could use it on, there's, Cloud, I think you can host it on Cloudflare, you can host it on Vercel. There's a whole bunch of different static hosting providers. The reason most people choose Netlify is because it's free. You can actually have it do the build process. So it'll actually build and deploy it for you. And you can host most production level websites, honestly, that aren't huge traffic for free. So it's really cost effective, and you can run your Drupal site on something like Pantheon's development, which is what I do, development version, and you don't necessarily have to pay for that either. So you can actually run a Drupal site with Gatsby for free, and it's pretty nice. So I have this module installed. I'm going to go and show you here, and I'm going to do something else real quick. Okay, so I have something called ngrok spun up. And this just allows me to create a local tunnel into my development server on port 8000. So you can see this URL maps to my local host 8000. If you were to go to this URL, please don't, because you can only have so many requests, but you could get to this local running Gatsby site that I have running right here. So I'm going to go to where I have, I have the Gatsby module installed. I have this fast builds module, which allows you to do some build caching things. We're not going to go through that. And I have this JSON API instant preview and incremental builds module enabled. So if I were to go to here and I drop in my Gatsby preview server URL, which I already did, I tell it what entity types I want to send to the Gatsby preview server. I want file entities and content entities to be sent. Now I'd save it. And in theory, if this was set up right, it's not going to work quite yet because I need to do one thing. Give me 1 second. I need to grab this. So I need to, when I'm running this command, I need to set this environment variable. You can do this in an environment file, or if you just put it on the beginning of the command, it'll run. It's basically saying I need to enable this refresh endpoint. It just allows that, allows an external source like Drupal. Where's that? Oh, I was looking at the wrong one. Okay. Okay, so I want to run Gatsby develop. That was my other site I had running before, so ignore that. If I run this, now it opened up this refresh endpoint, which means Drupal can now send data to my Gatsby development server. And now if I were to pull it up here, I have this blog post. And hopefully just refresh, make sure it's still running. And let's find this blog post about guitars. That's that one. It's not loaded yet for some reason. Okay, it's loaded now. There we go. And I'm just going to change this somehow. I'm going to add some exclamation points here. And so when I save this, ideally, I shouldn't have to refresh this. It should just save. We'll see if it actually is working. There you go. You can see how it changed. So I have a live preview set up. So if you're a content editor, you could have a preview site, which is just using preview, using a Gatsby development server. You could run locally for your client, or you could use Gatsby Cloud, which is just available at gatsbyjs.com. And that has this, you can spin up your own preview servers. It hosts it for you. And it has what's called incremental builds, which means it's much faster build times. One thing you run into with big, large-scale Gatsby sites is if you have thousands of pages, sometimes your build times could be 10, 15 minutes, and no content editor wants to wait 10 or 15 minutes after they click publish for it to go live. Incremental builds is kind of like a smart mechanism, so it only builds the pages that have changed. So it can take that 10 or 15-minute build time where it builds that static assets, and it cuts it down to 5, 10, 30 seconds, depending on how big your site is, but it's super fast, and that's much more manageable. Content editor can wait 10 seconds for their stuff to actually be live to people, but they don't want to wait 10 minutes. So that's one reason to maybe look into Gatsby Cloud if you are building larger scale Gatsby sites. For simple stuff, though, it's not necessarily needed. So that's the demo. I'll keep my screen sharing up in case there's any questions, but feel free to drop any questions in the chat or unmute yourself and we can discuss. So I know I went really fast because I wanted to cram a lot of content into 1 hour. So hopefully that didn't go too quick for people, but if some of the syntax was not familiar, it's just, you might need to do a little more looking into React if you don't have React experience, or some modern JavaScript stuff. I know that's the stuff that really tripped me up when I was getting started, is I didn't have a lot of that. But once you kind of get the idea of how that works, then you see that Gatsby is just kind of a layer on top of that. So it's just really a React framework for building really cool, really fast websites.
Cool. This is kind of, I've been wondering about, like, what's the glue that puts this together, right? And, I am not very much JavaScript, right? So do you have any resources or places that, we could go to pick up modern JavaScript and React?
So there's quite a bit of, let me see if I can find it here. There's quite a bit of React courses and such available. I would recommend that's a good thing to start on. I'm trying to find where I did a presentation called Modern JavaScript for the Drupal Developer. And I'm trying to find if that resource is live. I don't know if it was recorded, or I know my slides are available. Let's see, this might be, no. Okay, so it's Drupal Camp Atlanta. Let's see if it's, sometimes I forget where I talked about things. So I don't know if the Drupal Camp Atlanta stuff was recorded. Should have been, but let me see if I can get my slides for that. So here's a link to, I'm gonna stop sharing. I'll post in the chat a link to my slides for that session. And there's, if you don't have any, if you're looking for like a really, if you're like me and you're like, why is all of a sudden it seem like JavaScript is changing? It seems like, when I started in Drupal, it seemed like JavaScript was just JavaScript, right? We just used jQuery. We didn't mess with it too much, but we just used it where we needed it. And now it seems like there's all these new things with JavaScript. Well, there's kind of some history there. I go through that in that session, and I talk about, I have some links to different code sandbox things for trying out some of these different syntax that really threw me when I was getting like arrow functions and the map function and template strings, so that those code sandbox links could be helpful for trying out little snippets of things. And I don't know if, again, this was at Drupal Camp Atlanta this year. I would check YouTube because they might have posted this video that I did of the session. I'm not exactly sure though. I haven't done a lot of searching on that. And then, yeah, I do have a YouTube playlist for Gatsby and Drupal. So Andy posted that. Thank you, Andy. That it's a little outdated. It's about 1.5 years old, but 95% of it's still the same. The only difference is maybe the UI of what the Gatsby Drupal module looks like since then. Everything else is pretty much identical. And then, yeah, I would say Wes Boss has some really solid courses from what I haven't taken any, but I've listened to some of his podcasts, and I've heard a lot of people speak very highly of Wes Boss. So definitely check that out. Cool. Well, thanks everyone. I appreciate it. Appreciate John letting me speak and talk a little bit about Gatsby. I always like to be able to speak about it whenever I can.
I was wondering if I can ask a question really quick. Do you have any examples of getting media items out of Drupal into Gatsby? Media entities.
So give me 1 second here. If you go to, so I used to work for an agency called Third and Grove. Some of you may have heard of it. I'll post thirdandgrove.com. So that's the website that's built on Gatsby. And here's the source code for that website. It's open source. So if you want to see, I'm pretty sure we use media there quite a bit, quite frequently. That website is, I would say I didn't build it, so I can't take credit for that. Some of the best practices we use, we might not use today if we were to rebuild it, but there's a lot of really good stuff still in there, and good examples of how things can be used. And the cool thing about that website is, I mentioned hosting costs. I think that website costs $9 a month to host, and it's website for an agency that has 60 people working for it. So the hosting costs are one of the big benefits to doing something like this.
Nice.
But hopefully that helps. So there should be some examples of using media. I think media was used on that site, I hope.
Okay, thank you.
So is the incremental preview thing, is that good enough for production use, or is that?
Yep, a lot of people are using that in production today, and yeah, there's quite a few. One thing I will mention, another quick shameless plug, if you're in Drupal Slack, there's a Gatsby channel in there. We have weekly meetings on Tuesdays, 11 Central time, almost every Tuesday. Sometimes I can't make it and we end up canceling. Sometimes there'll be 10 people join, sometimes it'll be 3. So it's kind of like this, similar format. Most of the time we just talk about if you're doing something with Gatsby and you have questions, just an open forum to ask people that have maybe a little further along or have different questions. And so it's really just a discussion. But that's a good place to go if you do have questions like this. And sometimes I'll share in there, or other Drupal developers will share in there things that they're working on. So you can see active projects that are either about to launch or just launched. So you can see how some of the cool things people are doing with Drupal and Gatsby.
Cool. So all the theming then is done React. So the look and feel, the CSS, all that stuff, it doesn't take anything from Drupal templates or anything like that. It's just a data dump.
Yep, exactly. You're just using Drupal as the database. Exactly. So you can use whatever you want. There's all these different front-end frameworks, like maybe you've heard of Tailwind or Emotion or CSS and JS libraries where you're using like your CSS inside your JavaScript. Or you can still use just Sass if you're familiar with that and you just want to use Sass like you normally would. Have one, global Sass file that you load in. So there's all kinds, you can basically, it's free for you to choose how you want to develop it. So you can use front-end frameworks, Bootstrap, things like that, or you can just style it with Sass or however you want. It makes no assumptions, which is kind of cool, but also, flexibility is also daunting too, because you have to make choices.
And then the GraphQL stuff, does that does an API query and gets all the data and caches it locally, or is that real-time querying too?
And that is one of the biggest concepts that's hard for people to understand. It took me a long time. So when you run Gatsby develop, what it's doing is it's sucking in basically the entire Drupal database. Now you can hide things from JSON API if you don't want certain things to get pulled in. And it's only, you can make it authenticated or anonymous. Like basically whatever data you can see is what it'll pull in, but it pulls everything in locally. So when you're running Gatsby develop, all that data is sitting locally, in that running process. So when you make a GraphQL query, it's not going out to Drupal anymore. It's doing it locally. It pulls all the data in right away. It sucks it all in. And then it's only querying that local database, which is kind of sitting on your local machine.
So each time you make a change on the Drupal site, it has to suck down all the data over again.
Yep, and that's where, like the live preview, the way that live preview works is Drupal sends that JSON data to the Gatsby develop process. Gatsby develop updates its data store, and that page sees that there was an update in the data store and just automatically updates the page without loading. So that data can get updated with that live preview. And incremental builds works basically the same way on Gatsby Cloud. Like it's a running process. It sends the data, it reads it, and then it updates the page live.
Okay, so it's kind of like a push then when you do that,
Yeah,
instead
exactly.
of a pull query. Okay.
Exactly.
Cool.
So Drupal pushes the JSON into. So yeah, hold on. I'll just share one more thing. I know we're already over time, but so if I would look at ngrok, it gives me this useful interface here. And you can remember I enabled that refresh endpoint. So this is the data that it sends to Gatsby. So it's just sending just JSON API data for this node article. If I look at the title of this one, I don't remember what it was, but I think this was a blog post about, I added 3 exclamation points. So it sends that specific JSON data down Gatsby process knows the source plugin, that Gatsby source Drupal plugin knows how to read that data, and it updates the Gatsby data locally.
And for that to work on the Gatsby end, does Gatsby need to actively be running Gatsby run develop, or I guess the Gatsby end? That needs to be actively running, right, in order
for this to work, right? Yep, exactly. Right. So the other thing that we didn't get to is there's that module that I mentioned is called Gatsby Fast Builds.
Yep.
So let's say you ran Gatsby Build or you ran Gatsby Develop, it pulled everything in, and then you shut down the process and you made a bunch of changes on Drupal. You changed a bunch of articles, added a few, whatever. The next time you run Gatsby Develop or Gatsby Build, there's basically an entity change log on Drupal, and there's a timestamp of when you last ran it, and it only pulls in what's changed since the last timestamp. So let's say you had 10,000 articles, it might take a long time to pull all that data in, but if you turn on that fast builds module and you enable it on your Gatsby site, the next time you run it, it's gonna only sync those things that have changed. It's gonna keep everything else cached locally.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, so that's how that works. And yeah, we didn't get a chance to look at that, but there's, I think, pretty good documentation in the README of that module.
I just had one last question. I know we're way over, but if you had any resources, I guess my general question is content moderation. That's definitely a thing that, all of our clients love content moderation and stuff. How does that fit into this process? Like live preview seems like it kind of does that if you just publish it always, but.
So yes, that is one of the areas that's still in need of some improvement, but you can get a basic workflow. The content previews can work with unpublished content. And there was a checkbox on that UI that said only trigger builds for published, which means you could have your Gatsby site. And if you create an article and it's unpublished, it'll be available on that preview server. And then when you check the publish button and click save, it'll actually trigger a live build and it'll go to production. So you can have that kind of preview state where it's not live yet, but it's previewable. So if the content isn't published yet, it's previewable, but it's far from perfect. It's the end goal is to do more integration in with content moderation. So you can specify these content states should be sent to the preview server, and this is the content state that should be sent to the live, production build. Mm-hmm. But it's not there yet, and it's probably quite a ways off till it will get there, to be honest. But
seems like a complicated thing anyway. So yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, but it's coming at some point. It's just there's some other things on the roadmap that have to be tackled first.
Cool, thank you.
Cool.
And at least one more question, but I don't want to keep people, so.
Yeah, well, I mean, anyone can feel free to drop off, but I'll stay. I have a few more minutes. I have no meetings for the next little bit, so I can stay for another few minutes if you have a question.
Okay, so the service on the Gatsby side, which takes the notification of content updates and stuff, how does that know requests or information is coming from your Drupal site and not from some other actor that says just tries to inject their own information in there?
Yep. Okay. So that's a good question. So if you set it up on Gatsby Cloud, it gives you a unique preview webhook and a unique build webhook, just like any other webhook type provider would. And you put that in your Drupal site. There's also the URL is pretty unique, but of course someone could maybe get a hold of that URL somehow. There's also an option in the Gatsby admin page on the Drupal site for a secret key. And basically you can configure that secret key, and then in your Gatsby config file, you can add that key. And as long as those keys match, then it knows that the data can be processed. So it checks, and if the structure of the data isn't valid or that key doesn't match, it's not going to process the data. It'll just ignore it. But if those tokens are the same or those keys are the same, then it will say, okay, this is a valid request. I'll process that data.
And then do it over HTTPS as well. So it's
yeah.
Okay. Cool. Oh.
Awesome. Well,
that's it. Thank you so much.
Appreciate the questions.
For coming
And feel free on Drupal Slack. I'm just codekarate on Drupal Slack. So feel free if you have any questions or I'm in the Gatsby channel most of the time, but otherwise you can always DM me as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, we'll see you later.
Yeah, see everyone. Thank you.
Bye.